Now, while South Africa will phase in an orderly opening up of the economy when the hard lockdown ends on April the 30th, it is a mistake to think our lives will return to normal or what we were accustomed to before COVID-19. This pandemic has impacted every aspect of our lives as we know it, most notably how we travel and how we transport goods and services. Joining me to talk about a new transport regime as we emerge from the hard lockdown is a Transport Minister, Fikile Mbalula. Minister, thank you so much for coming on to The Fix. Before we get into this really excellent piece that you wrote a few weeks ago about reimagining public transport and also the sector in the age of COVID-19. Just some quick clarity. On May the 1st, when the hard lockdown ends, we are going to see several sectors, most notably manufacturing and so on, come back in. How is the transport regulations going to be affected? We already know that the 70% in taxis remain and no provincial travel is going to happen, but is public transport going to be available during the working day?
Thank you very much for having us, Karima. There's no doubt public transport will be available, and public transport is the heartbeat of the nation. You can't get anyone anywhere, school kids, workers, anywhere without public transport. So we've got to reimagine the new normal in the context of, COVID-19 in South Africa and the world over.
So if it is available, Minister, what are people going to have to do to make sure that social distancing is practiced? And more importantly, do the different transport methods and modes have the capacity? For example, we've seen in places like the Eastern Cape, taxis, for example, not necessarily practicing social distance. We don't necessarily have everyone with a mask. We know that it's now mandatory for people when they go outside to wear masks. How are you going to ensure compliance from everybody? Are trains, for example, going to be running normally, particularly the metro rails?
The new normal means that we've got to change things and also adapt, informed by the material conditions that we find ourselves in. If you pick on trains, for instance, that over-congestion is a no-no. It cannot happen. It cannot be allowed. In terms of law enforcement, we've got to ensure that does not happen. But over and above that, the new normal is about yourself. It means if we say mask is mandatory, it means when you leave your house, as much as government will come to the party to produce masks and give to people, it means now you can produce your own mask at your own home, and it is mandatory that before you enter any public space, transport in particular, you must have your mask on.
Okay, so let me just understand, Minister. Come May the 1st, right? If you work in, let's say, construction or you work in manufacturing, and you want to take a train, on the Cape Rail, is that train going to be available? We know those trains are always overcrowded. Who is going to ensure that that train is not overcrowded? Is it going to be PRASA? Is it going to be the local police and the army that have been deployed specifically? Who exactly is the buck going to stop with?
Well, we've got to ensure that first the PRASA security, and then supported by the police, the railway police, to ensure that trains are not congested and overcrowded. Should a train be encountered to be overcrowded, it will be stopped right there and there in terms of its operation. It is easier to control the train than the taxi. It means our trains will be on 24/7 supervision, in a sense that you get people who do all sorts of funny things on the train, stop riding, surfing, and all of that. That's going to come to an end. No tolerance to that. 24/7, every hour supervision. A train is on that mode, it will be stopped right there.
So, Minister, is it correct to say that when the trains are going to be open, that the mornings when people rock up at the stations, you're actually going to have PRASA personnel, police and army ensure that people queue properly, that only certain amounts of people get into carriages? Is that what you're promising South Africans?
That is what I promise South Africans, that the police and in particular railway police and security of PRASA will be ready with that. At the present moment, we're working on the capital expenditure in relation to responding to COVID-19 to ensure the corridors that you see all over are also, erected on the train sides in the stations to ensure that as you go in, come out, you are disinfected, but over and above that, sanitized.
Minister, one of the problems that you've had was massive corruption in PRASA. We've had PRASA stock and equipment stolen, and there's been no railway police, there's been no security at all. Where are these people suddenly going to come from, and where are you going to get the money from?
COVID-19 has made us to move with speed on certain things that we're already planning and implementing. PRASA have got capital expenditure, with part of it, Treasury has been asked to transfer for operational expense, and that is what needs to happen with speed at the present moment. Otherwise, we're facing a total disaster. As a minister, from where I'm standing and looking at the new normal, there's no train that will move and will be on the move unless the terms I'm talking to you about in terms of security are implemented. A day, half a day is enough for me to stop a train from moving. And it will not move because we're doing this collaborative with the police and also within, the means of our own capacity that at the present moment, the PRASA administration is basically working on.
Now, Minister, how much is that capital expenditure that you're going to get? Are you going to get it in one tranche? And more importantly, that railway police that has been non-existent, are you recruiting now? Are you hiring? Where's the security personnel going to come from?
There is a railway police. It is only static, but it's not enough. Security, it is there, of PRASA, that is operational, so it has to be fixed to be able to respond to the COVID-19 situation. But over and above that, we've got to bring in emergencies in place to ensure that they were able to address the situation. So as we continue to normalize the new normal going into the future.
Okay, Minister, let's go to the piece that you wrote about imagining transport in the era of COVID-19. And we all know this disease is going to be with us for a very long time. I mean, we've got 5 levels. We are only going to go to level 4 on the 1st of May. And some of the questions that you said we should be preparing for, you said, should domestic travel include things like temperature screening? Would countries of the world demand COVID-19 health certificates for arriving passengers, and are trains and buses and taxis also to have this fixture? Now, this is, of course, not long into the future. This is now. Just take us into some of the policy considerations that you are mulling to make sure that we don't, export this disease through traveling. Are you, for example, going to be making sure that when, let's say, air transport happens, that everyone boarding a plane is going to have to be temperature checked and will have to have a certificate that say they are COVID-19 negative?
Yes, Karima, this is what I characterize as post 9/11, and the COVID-19 can be equated to that it is a new normal. It will require new measures, particularly when it comes to air travel, among others. So we're going to have stringent measures that we're mulling over that. We need to know a person before departure from a country as to that particular person is in a good state of health when they actually arrive. Are they in a good state of health? Not only the screening is enough. You will understand that the regulations have brought in the testing, and that happens within a mandatory period of quarantine. So if you're traveling and at the same time you are visiting and so on, going into the future, it is going to be compulsory that certain things need to happen health-wise that are going to redefine a new, shift in terms of how we travel and how we exist in the context of traveling arrangements as they exist now. They will be totally different going into the future. It means health status have got to be known prior if it is possible, and therefore it has got to be confirmed one way or the other. And then the health hygiene detection, is going to be a permanent feature of our way of living.
Now, Minister, this obviously is going to have enormous impact on the industry. I mean, people normally buy tickets in advance. People who go on vacation, they get specials, and their health status might change by the time they have to board. So when will a person, let's say, for example, you introduce this question. I mean, temperature screening is easy to do. But if someone is meant to be negative in terms of the virus when they actually board the plane, how are you going to deal with bookings? I mean, you talk about the possible digital ticketing system to be able to trace, and track passengers. But obviously, people will book 6 months in advance, but you're not going to know the health status of that person. So how are you going to make this feasible and workable?
You've got what is called yellow fever. If you travel to other countries, that is important. You must actually have. The new normal is going to require that as much as you book 6 months in advance, that you've got to get a certificate of testing prior to travel to a certain country, wherever you are going. It's going to be important. And when you land in that country, there will be other measures that you'll be subjected to. So the health regime, in terms of how it exists now, in terms of regulations, is going to be extended to the new normal. So we need to normalize, because you can't get into my country and I don't know your health status. Today, if you travel to Brazil, you go to East Asia, and everywhere you are required to have yellow fever. You come to Africa, yellow fever is going to be global now. You've got to have a certificate that proves that you've been tested. And should it be found on your arrival in terms of screening that there is a contradiction and all of that, that will mean something for you going forward. So all of those are going to be incorporated into the new normal going forward.
That is easier for, let's say, air travel, because there's a lot of infrastructure around air travel. But presumably, people must be healthy on all modes of transport. Our biggest transport in South Africa are taxis. They transport something like 16 million people in South Africa on a daily basis. But it's not a very regulated mode of transport. You often have very poor, compliance. How are you going to get the taxi industry on board to ensure things like temperature screenings, to ensure that people are not being transported when they are sick?
The easing down of regulations, as you can see, the dangers already in the Eastern Cape in terms of the funerals. It was a peaceful province at almost zero, and the funerals and the packing of people in the small rural towns, and the congestion of people is beginning to redefine a new situation for us in that province. The taxi industry, as you commute, not only taxis, but even buses, is going to be not a mess. It has got to be contained. So certain things have got to be mandatory. The masks, President Ramaphosa way, has got to be mandatory for everybody in the public transport. We've got to enforce that in terms of the law. Society has got to come to the party. Social distances has got to be kept inside that. But over and above, once people have, offloaded from those modes of transport, what happens in relation to that when they are on the ground? The movement on the ground in the taxi ranks and everywhere else. We've got to bring in the new normal to our people to begin to understand that we can't congest in groups. And for as much as that could happen and pose a danger, it means we'll go back to stage 5. But we will see as we ease the regulations step by step. Where are the dangers which we can anticipate where they are going to come from? What needs to be done to enforce the law?
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much to Transport Minister Fikile Mbalula. Certainly a very big hurdle to cross. We will have to engineer behaviour change, and of course that is a very difficult thing to do. Still coming up here on The Fix, economics has never been an exact science. So just what lies ahead on the economic policy front as the globe and South Africa charts a way forward during COVID-19? Stay with us.